Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Isobel Parker-Phillip, and before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded. Thank you for joining for the first Photo Live talk, which has been quickly rearranged to be online. It was an event that was meant to be in person, but due to the recent lockdowns in Melbourne, we've had to quickly pivot and go online. But it's meant that we can broaden the scope of the event. Originally, I was going to be in conversation with Grace Wood, who's one of the artists featured in Garden Variety, Photography, Politics and the Picturesque, an exhibition commissioned by the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria for Photo 2021 International Festival of Photography. But because we're now online, we can also be joined by Emmeline Zanelli and Luke Parker, who are calling in from Adelaide and Sydney respectively. So thank you all for coming. It's a wonderful opportunity to connect with three artists, and Emmeline and Luke were meant to be in Melbourne for the opening of the show, and with all that's going on, they haven't actually physically seen their work in situ. So it's, I'm sure, a very surreal experience for them. We're going to be accompanying the presentation with a slideshow with some in-store photographs, but because of what's been going on, the show hasn't been comprehensively documented yet. So we will be supplementing that with reference images where needed. Garden Variety is an exhibition that is site-specific from all its angles, from the way that it is realised on site, from the references drawn by all of the artists. It's an exhibition that was really made in dialogue with the Royal Botanic Gardens, and each of the artists conducted site visits. They worked through the archives and the collections library at the gardens to make new work. These are 7 new commissions that are being debuted for the show, and so it's going to be an incredible privilege to be able to hear from the artists about the generation of these works and the process of making them, because it's been a project that is a little bit different from an ordinary exhibition that goes on white walls in a gallery space. It's an exhibition that is situated outside, that is woven throughout the gardens, that sits in quiet dialogue with its surrounds. Each of the installations are situated at different spots in the gardens, and the structures that they sit on frame the landscape as much as the photographs themselves. And that was very important from the outset, that the gardens were never to be treated as a backdrop, but really to be treated as part of the exhibition itself. Garden Variety looks at the complex history and complex identities of the Melbourne Garden site. We often think of botanic gardens or public spaces, public parks, as idyllic moments of respite from the urban metropolis. But a site like Melbourne Gardens has a very rich and a very complex history. It is a space for scientific research. It is a space for education. It is a space for recreation. But it is also a political space, and we need only think of the fact that it is a garden that features introduced species on colonised land to be attentive to the political ramifications of that site. Garden Variety takes oblique looks at different elements of Melbourne Gardens history and its metaphoric identity, and each of the artists have focused on a particular facet of that history, and in no way seek to comprehensively speak about this site, because it is a slippery one. It is a complex one. So we're going to speak to 3 of the 6 artists that are included in the show. The other artists featured are Stephen Rowell, James Nguyen and Yvonne Todd. But firstly, I just wanted to ask you all to speak a little bit about the process of developing your work and the conversations you had with the gardens and with the site and with its history that led to each of the nuanced perspectives that you offer. So Grace, do you want to start? And I should say that Grace is the only artist who's actually seen her work in situ.
And only today.
And only today because of the lockdown. And before you begin, I might just start to share my screen so that everyone can see Grace's beautiful works in situ. So please just bear with me for a moment.
There it is. So I was so lucky to be able to work with the gardens really closely in realising my works, which are completely made up of archival images from the Botanic Gardens archive, and then also some images that I've found and taken, but largely sourced from the library and the digital library of the Royal Botanic Gardens. So I got to go on site between the COVIDs, or I think even before COVID, maybe even before COVID existed, and visit the herbarium and meet with the librarian and also some scientists. I met with someone who was like a fungus and mould specialist.
And they're world experts in fungus in Melbourne Gardens.
And really delved deeply into the history of the garden's collection of plants and species which are kept, the seed repository, etc., but then also this collection of images. So the works are a conglomeration of that research and speaking with them and hearing some weird stories about the history of the garden, which is, not without its strange and sometimes disturbing colonial background. As you'll see if you go and see the show and look at these shovels that are in the other space. But it was really great to be able to work those through to end up with these collages, which you kind of have to, it's hard to tell from this image, but there's a lot going in there. So you hopefully walk through and around the works and then can interact with them all separately and from there form a whole view of this archive, this incomplete archive that I've created from the archive.
Mm. And the way that each of these images operate almost like a field. They're not single photographic compositions that are meant to be seen in isolation. They really are meant to sit against, in front of, adjoining each other, so that it's almost a collage made up of collages. And integral to that is the fact that you encountered this within a rest house, one of the rest houses. It's the Rose Pavilion rest house. And so it is a space that is discrete. It's got a circumference, and when engaging with the work, you can walk in and around it and really see it almost as a kind of sculptural installation as much as a photographic display.
And I've felt so lucky to be able to work through that with Isobel and the team of designers and architects that have put this together, because I really love in my work being able to do that, because a photograph really is an incomplete object, and I'm always trying to subvert the image in the way I install the works so that you never see one whole thing and you're always seeing fragments. So the way of realising it in this area, and that you can walk around and through it and see a lot of different angles, views, bits are cut off, etc. I really love that. And also on the behind there's a yellow perspex, which functions almost as a mirror, and when you're walking through it reflects the other works and also the trees and gardens outside, which I really love, and I'm so glad the way that's worked out in person as well. It's just added another layer to those chopping bits that you get when you walk through the work.
Yeah, and I think that this image can communicate a little bit about the way that elements of the scenery that you can see in the pavilion itself become part of the composition. They become stitched into the plane of images that occur across each of these structures. And all of the structures, the premise for this show was really to have a soft footprint, to not impose an artwork on the gardens such that the gardens is eclipsed and becomes nothing more than a backdrop, but really to pull into focus the landscape and the locations. And as you can see in these installation frameworks here, each has been designed for the specific location and for the specific artist's work by the wonderful exhibition design team, Yusuf Sai and Hart. And as you can see, there are apertures and openings in these steel frameworks that turn elements of the vista into an image, and that recurs and appears elsewhere. And another important part of the dialogue that is created with these installations is the use of materials from the gardens where possible, namely in the weights that we've used. So in each installation, they're weighted with rocks that are from the gardens and piled up in their works yard that we've cannily pilfered for the purpose of the show. But Grace's rocks are important to acknowledge because in the top image on the top right-hand side of the field, one of the found images that is embedded in that collage features an arid garden that no longer exists, but you can see a stone pathway that's threaded throughout it. And the stones that are on that pathway are the very same stones that are weighting Grace's works down, which was actually a moment of serendipity that we didn't know until we were physically installing. But kind of speaks to the importance of maintaining the lineage of that space.
Really, there's not that much difference between those stones and these little fragments of the images that you see in the work, and they function quite similarly, really, as these incomplete snapshots of the past history of the gardens.
Yeah, which have been cut up but have been composited but have stayed in the same place. In the same way that these images, which are all housed in the herbarium up the road, now find new life and new animative force in these collages. Grace, do you want to speak a little bit about the way you've worked the plant specimens from the herbarium into it, and in particular the focus on fixtures and methods of attachment, that it was a recurring motif through the work?
Yeah, I've used, as you can see, with the ruler and the little colour chart thing in the corner of that large image, these ways of recording and documenting collection items, both while they're in the field and then once they're brought back into this more scientific location. A lot of the photographs that I was really interested in were taken while these scientists or explorers were out in the field trying to find new species or document species in their natural habitat, which is a very interesting term because the gardens is obviously completely constructed, and they're these fake natural habitats. And I kind of wanted to speak to that in the work, wherein a lot of these flowers or plant specimens are spliced together so they become real but also fake in the way they now exist. They're these utopian gardens or plants that don't really exist in real life. But yeah, the way they would take these photographs of these items out in nature and then bring them back in, they were always quite strangely tethered by a bit of tape or some blue tack, or the photographs would have people's hands in them for scale, or a seed pod is documented on someone's palm and you see the lines on their skin in relation to these natural items, and just the way that nature is interacting with the man-made and the personal. I found a lot of those moments really beautiful, so I really liked bringing those into the works. So some of those images are hiding in there if you look closely.
Yeah, there's it's a kind of rich resource in and of itself to delve into the micro moments that populate this work. In thinking through the garden's history, it's important to acknowledge that while today the practice of botanical collection is really integral to maintaining biodiversity and to the importance of research into climate resilience, it has a very botanical collection has a very also a problematic history that's bound up with imperialist intentions, and the removal of an Indigenous name of a plant and the attribution of a Latin name, the relocation of species to be propagated in botanical collections across the world is a fraught one, and one that needs to be acknowledged when thinking about a space like this.
Yeah, it's really all about theft when you look at it in these historical terms. I mean, even that image of the cactus garden with that pathway through it, that's Guilfoyle's garden that he created, and he was appointed to the gardens because they wanted it to be more picturesque, and they were kind of getting rid of a lot of the native trees that had grown on the lands, obviously for thousands of years. And he created this arid garden with these cactuses, which are obviously all introduced species that he'd collected on his travels. A practice that wouldn't probably be allowed, now, I'm sure. And from there, put them in there, took ownership of them, and they became what they are now. But they certainly weren't his to take.
And in your work, the plants almost feel semi-anthropomorphic. We see them tethered down, we see them held down. And the act of cutting a sample and holding it fixed to be dried out for posterity suddenly takes on quite an emotional force, I feel, when you see just...
it can become so violent. But I think an archive is kind of like that anyway, and especially this archive that I was so lucky to go through. A lot of the images are not really labelled, or there's nothing going with them to tell you where they're from or what they mean. And so you kind of end up making up your own stories about these images and their source, and repurposing or stealing them again, I guess.
Yeah, and it's the attribution of new narratives is what your work is doing here in clashing plants together so they feel like odd hybrids, and creating new fields for them. Yeah, thank you, Grace. So I might move on and show you an image of Luke's work. Luke's work is in a very different part of the gardens. It's actually outside near the observatory buildings, which have been on the site since the 19th century, and Melbourne Observatory was one of the most resourced observatories in the Southern Hemisphere. So when it was operative, it was providing important data for weather forecasting and the standardization of time, as well as celestial observation. And the structure that you can see in the background of Luke's work is the photoheliograph dome, which was constructed for the express purpose of viewing and tracking the transit of Venus. Luke's work also plays with celestial observation, but in a more mischievous way. So, Luke, can I just invite you to speak a little bit about your work and the dialogue that it has with the site?
Yeah, sure thing. Hi, everyone. I'd just like to say I'm zooming in from the beautiful Gadigal country today in Sydney. So, so as Isobel mentioned, this is just outside Melbourne Observatory, and like Grace, I visited the gardens and did a tour with garden staff. And at first we were toying with the idea of me working inside the structures, but for various reasons, somewhat due to their fragility, but also accessibility issues, we kind of abandoned that, and it kind of made more sense as the work took shape to be outside anyway. I've been working with astronomy images, both that I've made and historic astronomy images that I've kind of pulled into my work for a number of years. And I think that's probably why Isobel thought of me in terms of this site. What I wanted to do with this work was kind of continue that look, especially, or more a reference to the aesthetic of historic astronomy photography, which wasn't necessarily made for aesthetic reasons. Usually it was scientific reasons, but it kind of helped with the development of photography as they developed lenses and stuff to deal with photographing the night sky. That also kind of led to various kind of photographic technique developments. And I'm quite fascinated with those early photographs in particular, and they'd kind of started to appear in my works probably from about 10 years ago. And then a few years ago, I started actually shooting the night sky with a camera that had been left to me by my grandmother when she died, which is a 1920s medium format bellows camera that shoots in a panoramic format. It's quite a rudimentary camera, and so the most successful images that I could make with it were kind of time-lapse exposures. Really the kind of the thing that worked best was a photograph of the moon. And so I started kind of taking kind of shots of the moon and I'd kind of implement a system. I was looking back at kind of conceptual art photography in particular, and how, a system would be put in place to kind of capture something. So I was capturing the moon at various kind of stages in its cycle, and because of the time lapse, the images would become kind of streaks of light across the film. So they kind of became abstracted in a way as well. But for this particular work, I kind of toyed with playing with, like Grace, I guess, the images from the archive, so images that would have been taken at the observatory. But I kind of shifted away from that and into kind of constructing the images myself. And so that's what I started to do in my studio. I turned my studio into a dark room so that I could kind of do simple photo, analog photo techniques, like developing photograms that I'd been making. And so the room is kind of dark and studio-like. So I kind of started playing around with setting things up in the studio. Some of the objects that I was using, I'd actually procured with the intention of using them for photograms. So they were kind of things, I'll just quickly explain a photogram in case people don't know. It's where you put objects onto a light-sensitive surface and then expose it to light. And depending on the nature of the material of that object, it will either block the light or allow the light through, or to varying degrees. And it's kind of an early, avant-garde photography technique. So I'd been making photograms and I wanted to kind of push that into more of a 3D realm. And so in thinking about making a work for this site, I started to kind of create these like little cosmoses, little universes, or little kind of glimpses of the universe, but completely fake and constructed in the studio. At first I thought that I would, that they'd kind of be more seamless than they are. But quickly I kind of embraced the idea of being able to see all of the kind of tricks. So it's hard to see from this photo, but as you approach them, they stop looking like real astronomy photographs, and they kind of reveal themselves as quite kind of constructed and fake. You can see, the bits of string that I've used to hold up the planets, and you can see that the stars are actually just kind of shredded paper that I've scattered on the floor. And I'm quite interested too in early cinema, and early special effects and that kind of thing. So I think that aesthetic kind of crept in as well. And the structures that Belle, the designer, the architect, created, we talked about referencing the shapes from the observatory, but also from the instruments and cameras and telescopes that they would have been using in the observatory. So that's where a lot of the kind of curves come from.
Yeah, they themselves become apertures, which is a kind of reference back to the kind of foundational element of the camera and of photography, that it offers a window onto the world. And the structure that you can see in the far left of this install shot is a structure that doesn't feature in a photograph at all, but has this opening with a suspended mirror that kind of performs almost the same function. It's an aperture within a field of apertures, rather. And that tension that your work courts between what can easily feel like a photograph of the cosmos, and then images where you can see the power board in the background of the image. That tension is wonderful to engage with on site, because this is a work that sits outside the gate of the gardens. So you see it from on approach. You see it from the driveway that heads up towards the garden. So you have this long distance view, as you do of the domed observatory buildings, and then you come up close and you realise what you're looking at. You realise you're looking at styrofoam balls and desk lamps and not celestial orbs. So that kind of push-pull and that tension is quite compelling when engaging with the work.
Yeah, and I didn't want it to be flippant. I didn't want it to just be, kind of, oh, they're fake. When I was making it, I was really thinking about how, I was kind of constructing these microscopic things, but that in a funny way they are still images of the universe, because they're kind of in the universe and they're part of the universe. And so I was kind of really trying to play with macro and micro, and also kind of by inverting or turning the images to be not landscape, to kind of play on, vertical and horizontal. And a lot of the images are inverted from the way that I took them, so they're upside down. So I wanted there still to be a sense of kind of magic and, kind of gravity defying that sense within the photo. So, on some level they're kind of mischievous and playful, but on another level there's something kind of that I was working through about that kind of connectivity, really. Yeah.
And we always, it pushes against that presumption that we all carry, no matter how well aware of the mechanics of photography we are, that a photograph reflects the world back to us and shows us the way things really look. But and especially in a field of scientific enterprise, we expect that the images that we encounter tell the truth. But as a matter of fact, a lot of early astronomy photographs were doctored slightly and were amplified for visibility. So I think that the way that your work speaks to the slipperiness of photography, even in contexts where we expect to be shown facts, is also quite an apt reminder for people who can then carry that through to looking at the other images in the show. Yeah. So then Emmeline's work, which we unfortunately don't have an install shot of, but we can speak to how they're situated. These are located in and this is just 2 of the images. There's a suite of 4 on display, but they're situated in the William Tell Rest House. And I'll let Emmeline speak to the significance of William Tell as the propellant for this body of work. But the William Tell Rest House has these very dramatic peaked windows, and the structures that the work sit on echo that form. They have the same peaked windows, and the photographs themselves are the same size as the windows. They are on an axis, so the photographs can move and spin. So there's a pair of images that have both the front and the back featuring photographs. So there's always 2 in dialogue with one another, but it's a fluid dialogue. So Emmeline, do you want to speak a little bit about how you approach the work and the hook that is William Tell?
Definitely. Before I start, I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Kaurna people. They're the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking from today. I live on, and I made all my work for the show on Kaurna country, and I want to pay my personal respects to their elders past, present, emerging and future, and also acknowledge that the Kaurna sovereignty was never ceded. So I made work in response to the William Tell Rest House. Just over a year ago, or in early January, actually last year, I think it was, I did a visit to the gardens, and I got to ride on the staff buggy with Mark Lowry, who is a producer there. And
I think we've all had a ride on the buggy.
Yeah, my highlight.
I've been holding on to the back of it the last week.
I wanted to go on the buggy.
Oh, you have to go back. And while I was on the buggy getting like a really amazing comprehensive tour of the gardens, I said to Mark, I don't really know much about this space. I don't remember having been to the gardens before. Who's William Tell? And he just turned to me and started humming the William Tell overture. And I was kind of like, oh, wow, that's who he is. But really in my mind, what was kind of conjured was this cat and mouse chase scene of Porky and Daffy from Looney Tunes. So I was like, I recognize something to do with this person, but I'm kind of, by the look on Mark's face, I wasn't necessarily thinking that we had the same understanding of who this person was. But I think that Mark did hum that to me because from what I remember, he has a history in theatre and opera.
Yeah.
So there is a William Tell overture, which is really famous. It goes like dun, 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 dun. And it's used like all the time. It's used, but it was written in early 1800s, premiered in 1829. Anyway, when we got to the house, I was like, oh, I actually remember this because when I was 10, my mum took me to the gardens there when I had just gotten my first like mini dress. And she took a picture of me in the rest house. So already there was like kind of some personal relationships that kind of started popping up, and that kind of I did spend a day in the library at the gardens, which was really interesting to me as well. But I really found that having this kind of I'm quite interested in pop culture references, kind of I think more and more so. In my practice, and so having this kind of personal memory of having my photo taken in my first mini dress in the William Tell shelter, and then the Porky and Daffy cat and mouse chase, really made me think I really want to make something about this guy. So William Tell was a sort of a Swiss revolutionary who is kind of credited with being the person who allowed Switzerland to have its independence from Austria. And he's credited with making famous the gesture of shooting an apple off of, he shot an apple off of his son's head as a challenge from the sort of Austrian dictator at the time, Albrecht Gessler. And then he was captured and then they were taking him away on a boat to be executed, and the weather got really rough. And they said, "Oh no, we're all going to drown." And he said, "If you just let me out of my chains, I'll save the boat. And don't worry about it." And so they did. And then he kind of made his way to safety and then turned around and shot them dead as well. And that's kind of this moment that is credited with being the sort of the start of Swiss independence. So I think it's good to mention that kind of that story of him, because in the context of the name of the show, the politics and the picturesque, I think that, like, knowing that, to me, that gesture of the apple shooting is not necessarily political for me, but it definitely was first made famous as a political gesture of kind of saving his country, and it's kind of become this really condensed gesture of independence for Switzerland. So I kind of, after having those two initial references, kind of went home. Then a few days later, encountered someone else that said, I make this work about this guy. And said, do you know William Tell? I'm like, no. So I hummed the tune to them. And they said, oh, that's the theme song for The Lone Ranger. I was like, don't know what that is, but that's another really famous Western show, like black and white TV show that features the William Tell Overture. And so already it's sort of like snowballed from there, with me trying to find what other pop culture references had kind of recycled or remixed in some way, either the music associated with William Tell or the apple shot gesture. And so I really started to think about this apple shot gesture and the kind of variety of ways that it's been interpreted throughout visual media, and then also in sort of scores and remixing of scores. And something I really wanted to mention after watching the live talks, that live walkthrough that Isobel and Grace did this morning, was Isobel, how you said you mentioned the way that we kind of mythologize, and I thought that was really interesting to me, and how I felt like this gesture of the shooting of some small object off of someone's head had been, it was like this mythologized symbol, and I kind of I think that the way that this gesture for me has kind of popped up all throughout pop culture that I found throughout this project is this kind of empowering feeling that someone can be this kind of mythologized character, whether it's a Greek god or in this case it's William Tell, and they can kind of be this legend and this hero. And then through like Netflix and Sesame Street, and slowly making their way down, trickling down, they can make their way back into my bedroom, these mythologies, and then they're kind of accessible by that point in their Xeroxing to hell, that there's possibility for me to then recreate that mythology as my own. I actually...
And I think that point is important to raise in the context of the gardens too, because in its constant reenactment, whether it's in James Bond or the Hunger Games or whatever, this act of, the apple shot, the shooting of the apple off the head, becomes very abstracted away from the specificity of the story and the history of the story itself. And that kind of abstraction is also at play in the simple fact that William Tell's name is being invoked in a botanic gardens in Melbourne that has nothing to do with Swiss history. And so when you start to think about what is invoked in that name and the name of the rest house, it's another instance of mythology. I can't even say that word. I've talked too much today, but it's another instance of abstraction, and especially if we look at the architecture of the pavilion, of the rest house, which is derived from a chapel on the edge of Lake Luzerne in Switzerland, hence the use of the name William Tell. It's another exercise in myth-making that Australia has often participated in, whereby references from Europe are used that are completely divorced from and abstracted away from the concrete realities and the history of the site itself. But there's a deference to Europe and a borrowing of those cultural motifs, even though they they have no tethering to the location itself.
Yeah. I have like a 2.5 minute video of some references. If you'll let me share my screen,
Of
like
course.
maybe while I just could just say a little bit more about the process.
I will just stop sharing so you can take the steer.
Okay, cool. Because oh yeah, I'll share my keynote. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, so these are some images that I found also from the Swiss National Museum's online collection, which were kind of interesting to me because they really do just look exactly like the William Tell shelter in the gardens. And I liked the one especially on the right with the rough seas, because that like kind of links to one of the pictures that I made, which I kind of have at the end. And these are just some other, like, I really like these, how they kind of depict him as this kind of like really muscly hero man, which again, I think kind of connects to this sort of mythologizing and exaggeration and glorification, which I kind of really like. Now, this is my little video. I'll turn it down a bit. So these are some of the references that I used in the collages. I just took them as screenshots from YouTube or movies that I just like, if they're on Stan or Netflix or sorry, I don't know if you can. So there's Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Popeye, Simpsons before there was the Power Rangers where Kimberly shoots Snizzard. This one's in the centre is Stanley Kubrick, Clockwork Orange. On the right, Matthew McConaughey in a rom-com, which like I hope none of you have ever seen. But I really like kind of the diversity of the way that this gesture has been used, and I think that it was a really exciting kind of way to be able to have excuses to consume a lot of media whilst making the work. And then to kind of really try and pastiche as many varied sources as possible in the kind of large collage works that I ended up making that were photographed and then kind of made smaller. On the right there, that's Roger Federer and behind the scenes of making a commercial, and he's getting his assistant to balance a can on his head. So I printed lots of copies of the few references that I decided to use, and then made 4 large collages that kind of involve a small amount of kind of set building and costume of myself. But I really wanted to kind of, like I said before, this idea of something trickling down to like my bedroom where I can access and then remake these mythologies into my own version of the William Tell myth. And that's kind of why I wanted to use stuff that was just, I guess, just stuff from my shed. Like there's a bow and arrow that I made from an Oki strap and 2 old hacksaws, and then welding some darts to a scrap of metal, and then using old kind of gumboots and an old dartboard and just tarps and I think that for me using and I guess I started from this idea of like a garden shed, not that the rest house is anything like a garden shed, but this idea of like I don't know, making things that were from my own home environment, like that was kind of right at the bottom, right at the trough of this trickle down of this legend or this hero, this mythology, kind of,
Amazing. It's wonderful to see all these references played out, fragments of which we do recognise from the actual images that they're completely repurposed, so that they're turned into other compositions entirely. So these are the other 2 that weren't shown on the other PowerPoint, that are essentially the other sides, and when the work is interacted with, when it's spun, it almost echoes and reperforms the apple shot itself, because there's a precarity to the way that the images sit in their structures, that they can be spun.
Yeah, and I really like in a lot of the pop culture references, like this, the character who's about to get whatever it is shot off their head is kind of really anxious and like, ooh, and there's a lot of risk involved, and they really play that out. And I like this idea of them kind of swinging around, and there's that kind of like, will it miss? And so there's like 2 pairs, and then each pair has a target and a shooter. So there's the shooter on the left, target on the right, and a shooter on the left, target on the right. So yeah, and that concludes my presentation.
And that takes us to 4:45, and I just want to first reiterate that these are really works that should be seen in situ, that should be moved amongst, be navigated, be experienced in proximity to their environments, to see the shadows that interplay, to see the reflections, to see the views that get cut up and cast and spun with emerlines. And so it does feel quite odd to be speaking to a show that is so assertively located online, but these are the times in which we live. And I just really want to thank the 3 of you for taking the time to unpack some of the stories and the narratives in your work. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope those of you watching will get a chance to come and see the exhibition while it's on. It's on until at least the 7th of March. Because of all of the disruptions from COVID, we will be looking to potentially extend it. So please do just check in on when a final completion date is, but please enjoy. Thank you.
Thanks, Isobel.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.